Hello, and welcome to episode 6 of Kevin's Novel Ideas. Appreciate you joining. Today, I have a very interesting book I'd like to talk about that I just recently read, probably just a week or two ago. The name of it is Same as Ever, A Guide to What Never Changes. And I thought this was a really interesting book because it seems like, the zeitgeist now is that there's so much uncertainty with what's going on in the world. Kind of the, the ground is shifting out from beneath us, and people are sort of losing their way in regards to what's going to happen next. What does the future hold? We've got AI, we've got geopolitical turmoil. There's a whole bunch of things, economics changes. There's a whole bunch of things going on, and it's hard to process. I think a little bit of it is information overload through media, but also I think there are periods of time when things start to change quite a bit, and people don't know what's going to happen. So I thought this book would be timely to kind of discuss that. And the author, who's Morgan Housel, Housel. Again, the title is Same as Ever, A Guide to What Never Changes. So the premise here is that he starts out with a story that he tells when he was a kid, that he was in a ski team. He would go out skiing with friends, and there was one weekend where he grew up around Lake Tahoe, that they had a lot of snow, new snow, and they would go kind of on the off-country slopes. So these guys were experienced skiers. He went with two other kids. Nice new snow. They go out there, ski in the morning, have a great time, go back to their locker room because they were on the ski team. He decides to change and go home, and the other two decide, hey, we've taken a little break, we've had lunch, let's go out and ski some more. So they go out, and he decides not to. And those two, his friends, end up getting buried in an avalanche and dying. A very tragic story. And that got him thinking throughout his life in regards to just the little freakish examples about how much today world relies on a few tiny things that we never think about. That just the mere, it's a little bit of the butterfly effect, that the butterfly flaps its wings across the other side of the world and something changes. But even more so, kind of just how we sort of hang by a thread as far as how things happen. And he gives a couple more examples throughout history of this, which I thought were interesting and maybe we're not familiar with. But how little things that nobody could have expected could change the course of history. So he starts, and this is in the first chapter called Hanging by a Thread. I'll read this part. The Battle of Long Island was a disaster for George Washington's army. His 10,000 troops were crushed by the British and its 400-ship fleet. But it could have been so much worse. It could have been the end of the Revolutionary War. All the British had to do was sail up the East River, and Washington's corner troops would have been wiped out. But it never happened because the wind wasn't blowing in the right direction, and sailing up the river became impossible. Historian David McCullough once told interviewer Charlie Rose that if the wind had been in the other direction on the night of August 28th, 1776, it would have all been over. No United States of America if that happened, Rose asked. I don't think so, said McCullough. Just because of the wind, history was changed, asked Rose. Absolutely, McCullough. So there's an example of just the wind being in the wrong direction could have changed the course of history. Here's another one. Compelled to save money, Captain William Turner shut down the fourth boiler room on his great giant steamship for its passage from New York to Liverpool. Decision would slow the ship's voyage by 1 day, an annoyance but worth the savings as the passenger ship industry struggled economically. Little did he know, anyone else know, how fateful the decision would be. The delay meant Turner's ship, the Lusitania, would now sail directly into the path of a German submarine. the Lusitania was hit with a torpedo, killing nearly 1,200 passengers and becoming the most important trigger to rally U.S. public support for entering World War I. Had the fourth boiler been operating, Turner would have reached Liverpool a day before the German submarine had even entered the Celtic Sea, where it crossed paths with the Lusitania. The ship likely would have avoided attack. A country may have avoided a war that became the seed event for the rest of the 20th century. Interesting to think about these things, right? One more example. Giuseppe Zingara was tiny, barely 5 feet tall. He stood on a chair outside a Miami political rally in 1933 because that was the only way he could aim his gun across the crowd. Zingara fired 5 shots. One of them hit Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak, who was shaking hands with Zingara's intended target. Cermak died. The target, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was sworn in as president 2 weeks later. Within months of his inauguration, Roosevelt transformed the U.S. economy through the New Deal. John Nance Gardner, who would have become president had Zingara hit his target, opposed most of the New Deal's deficit spending. He almost certainly wouldn't have enacted many of the same policies, some of which still shape today's economy. So had Giuseppe been a couple inches taller and not had a better view, he might have ended up killing Roosevelt rather than Cermak. There's numerous examples through history, and I guess his point is that the world is pretty random, and it's really impossible to forecast things. And although we try, and we have talking heads on TV now forecasting this, that, and the other thing, it's very difficult. And I guess this rang true for me because I always think back on, we tend to worry about things, right? Worry is kind of trying to predict the future, right? You're kind of concerned about something happening in the future, so you're going to put plan A, B in place, or you're not going to do something because you're worried about something happening. And over time, I've kind of noticed that whatever I've worried about, usually almost always doesn't happen at all. So putting in place contingencies for that really didn't matter. And if something bad happens, or even if something good happens, it's usually something that wasn't even on my radar. So I think we like to think people like certainty in the world, but it's more realistic in admitting, and as he points out, it's more realistic in admitting that if you know where you've been, you realize we have no idea where we're going. Events compound in unfathomable ways. To base predictions on how people behave rather than on specific events is kind of what he's hinting at here. That it's hard to predict events, but you can kind of predict behavior, and that gets back to the title, that a guide to what never changes. So he wants us to focus in on looking at how people behave, which then gives you an indication of what might occur in the future, rather than trying to predict a particular event is much more difficult, which very much rings true to me. He points out we are very good at predicting the future, except for the surprises, which tend to be all that matter. The biggest risk is always the one that no one sees coming, he points out, because no one sees it coming. No one's prepared for it, and if no one's prepared for it, its damage will be amplified when it arrives. It's kind of a cycle thing, that it's actually that if you've prepared for something, you can mitigate that risk, but if you're unprepared for it, that's going to have the largest impact, right? Which is kind of interesting to point out. And he goes into another example being the Great Depression, and he indicates that he's asked many economic historians to give the name of one person who predicted the Great Depression in the 1930s, and no one predicted the Great Depression. They could always say, and I always find this interesting, today's day and age, people are predicting a recession, a market bubble, things are going to go down, stuff with crypto's going to go up so much, and I try to stay out of all of those although I jump in now and again. I do end up realizing I don't know much at all, and it is very difficult to predict the future. But as he points out, there are several things. Um, one more example in regards to risk management. Um, he points out what your imagination can't fathom is the dangerous stuff. It's why risk can never be mastered. Invest in preparedness, not prediction, is Nassim Taleb, an economist's recommendation. He gives another example in regards to Houdini. Houdini was a magician, early 20th century, uh, amazing magician, world renowned, right? He was able to get out of things and perform these feats that no one could understand. But he also, as you might be familiar with the story, he used to invite people up on stage to punch them in the stomach as hard as they can. And he was prepared for it when they came up on stage. But one time, he had some college students backstage. I don't know how they got backstage, but one of them punched him in the stomach, and he was not prepared for it. And he ended up dying because of that punch. That's the story. So even though he was prepared when he was on stage, a surprise happened, and all that preparedness went out the window. So the point being, the world is an uncertain place. It's very hard to predict the future, but there are certain things that we can kind of hang our hat on, and if we focus in on some of these things, then at least we'll get, in regards to our decision making and how we view the future, that we can have a little bit of certainty, but it's more around human behavior than anything else. The first thing he points out, the first rule of happiness, is low expectations. So that's something that's never changed. Happiness is based upon people's expectations, right? There's been many studies. I've read many books about happiness. And he says, but people's expectations then just rise. So even though things are improving, we have higher expectations as things improve. If not more, because those improvements also benefit other people around you, he points out, whose circumstances you anchor to. So we judge our happiness by what is happening to people around us. So if they're doing much better, then we might feel less happy because they're doing better. It's a strange phenomena, but if we're aware of this, right, we could catch it. We could catch it and change our thoughts in regards to it, right? He points out some of today's economic worries would have puzzled a 1950s family. The ownership rate was 12%, home ownership rate was 12 percentage points lower in the 1950s than it is today. An average home was a third smaller than today's, despite having more occupants. Food consumed 29% in an average household's budget in 1950 versus 13% today. Workplace deaths were 3 times higher than today. And that's the economic era we long for? And its answer is yes, and it's important to understand why. The reason is there's no such thing as objective wealth. Everything is relative, and mostly relative to those around you, as I point out. So that's the reason. So if we're aware of it, we could become more, I would say, grateful that we are actually living in good times, much better than people were in the 50s. Now you can point out it's not all economic, and there's family relations and relationships and things like that, and I believe that has something to do with it. But I think his point here is well taken, that one thing that doesn't change is that we anchor our expectations and our happiness on what happens to other people. And the awareness of that can help you predict how people react and also predict how you will react to certain things. So I think that is a interesting point, and one that I've found, like I mentioned, I've read books in regards to happiness, why people are happy, and that is something that they always point out. We judge our happiness relative to everyone else. And it becomes even worse today because we have social media. So social media, as he points out today, as a new element in which everyone in the world can see the lifestyles, often inflated, faked, and airbrushed, of other people. So I think that's why we're seeing more depression and what we what we feel is unhappiness with our circumstances, even though objectively those circumstances were probably better than they were in the past. So it's a little bit of a mind game, but if we're aware of that, awareness, I always like to say awareness is the first step to action, right? First, you have to be aware of something before you can take action to address it. So to have the awareness of that's what we're doing, we can more easily address it and either look at social media and laugh and say, oh, they're having that nice vacation, but, you know, like me, they have to go to work the next week, or just appreciate something good that's happening in somebody else's life and say, oh, that's available for me also, rather than draw a comparison. There's all ways that we can change our thinking in regards to this, but it all starts with awareness in what we do, what our behaviors are. Second thing he points out that never changes is something that I've long thought true and which shows up constantly when you look for it, is that people who are abnormally good at one thing tend to be abnormally bad at something else. So just because you're good at one thing, really good at one thing, doesn't mean that you're going to be good at something totally different or another thing. And I've always seen this in business and looking at the world around me, that people who are good at one thing think it will apply to something else. Either an entrepreneur, and he points out either an entrepreneur, or let's say another example I just thought of was Michael Jordan. Phenomenal basketball player, right? But if you remember, Michael Jordan, he actually changed careers while he was the best basketball player in the world. He went to go play baseball, right? It was always a passion of his, and he thought, oh, I'm great at basketball. I'm going to take this opportunity. He played for the Chicago White Sox. He played in their AAA league. It didn't turn out well. He wasn't a great baseball player, as it turns out. And in this book, he points out Elon Musk. Elon Musk has done great things. You know, he developed this electric car, the Tesla, and SpaceX, and then now he's turned recently to Doge, which I would say didn't go well, the Department of Government Efficiency. And he bought Twitter, which I don't necessarily think is going all that great, which he's kind of started focusing back on his core business again, which is Tesla. So I think that's another thing that we can think of as something that never changes. So when we're looking at investments or just in life in general, if we think we're great at something else and then try to say, I'm good at this, I'll try that. Sort of more focus your core competencies, know what your core competencies are, and sort of stick to your lane. It's good to try different things, but don't make life decisions based upon it. Just because you're good at one thing, that you might be able to be good at something else. I think we've all heard this quote too, and it's similar. It's similar to what he points out here from Bertrand Russell. The fundamental cause of the trouble is that in the modern world, the stupid are cocksure, while the intelligent are full of doubt. And he points out a common trait of human behavior. I would say that this is the number 3 thing, is the burning desire for certainty despite living in an uncertain probabilistic world. So, and dealing with the math behind risk and uncertainty in general is difficult, something people have struggled with forever and always will. That something can be likely and not happen, or unlikely and still happen, is one of the world's most important tricks. And when I read that line, I thought of, and he gives an example in regards to the lottery here, which I'll read and then I'll get back to my point here. So he points out in this chapter called Wild Numbers that if one person plays the lottery, the odds of picking the winning numbers twice are indeed 1 in 17 trillion. But if 100 million people play the lottery week after week, which is the case in America, the odds that somebody will win twice are actually quite good. In fact, somebody called Diconius and Mulstier calculated it to be 1 in 30. That number didn't make any headlines. With a large enough sample, now people would never think that, right? You're like, what are the possibility that somebody could win the lottery twice? It just seems insane. But he's saying with a large enough sample, anything outrageous can happen. Um, Interesting thing to note and a good thing to be aware of, and that never changes. People are never good with probabilities and never understand, as he points out, that something, what does he say? Something that can be likely and not happen or unlikely and still happen is one of the world's most important tricks. And throughout my life, I would say I was involved in sort of risk management part of finance, which is kind of what we called it, risk management. And it's important to understand these things. That and I when I was reading this, I thought of COVID, right? Which I always kind of thought of it as a risk management problem, right? Um, Things aren't one thing or the other. It's always probabilistic. If you take the vaccine, doesn't mean you're not going to get COVID. It just lowers it lowered the risk of getting it a little bit, but lowered the risk of getting, you know, terribly ill by it by quite a bit. And also there was a risk that if you took the vaccine, you could also get sick. You could have a reaction to it. Again, a risk, a probability, and I think looking at the COVID again with masking too, right? It's not going to prevent you from getting COVID. You could still get COVID. You can wear a mask, and you could still get COVID. You could keep all the rules. You can keep the distances, and you could still get COVID. You could still die of COVID. And having those examples then does not negate the fact that you shouldn't do it. And I guess it surprised me through that whole thing that people didn't understand that. But as he's pointing out here, it's something that's never changed with humans, that we always have a difficult time working with probabilities. We're more black and white. Either it is or it isn't, and it's not on a spectrum from 10% chance to 50% chance. We're not good at calculating the numbers. It's just kind of how our brains work for most people, and we also, we have these heuristics that we use to kind of make decisions quickly, and it fails us in times like that also. So again, something to be aware of when you're thinking about things. Would have been very helpful if somebody would have came on TV and explained probabilities and risk management on CNN. I don't think I ever saw anyone do that. I kind of wish they would. I actually had we had a doctor give us updates at the company I worked at, and he was very much explaining it that way in regards to COVID and the risk management side of it, which I thought was excellent. Unfortunately, the media and what we saw on social media didn't lean in that direction. Hopefully, the next pandemic, if it happens, we'll be in better shape. Hopefully, he points out in the same chapter, a 100-year event doesn't mean it happens once every 100 years. So we see all these natural disasters, and we're like, well, geez, how are they occurring? It seems like they're occurring so often. He explains this. It means that there's a 1% chance of it occurring in any given year. That seems low. We all agree. 1%, we shouldn't see that too often. However, there are hundreds of independent 100-year events, right? The tornado that wipes out a town, a hurricane, a flood, raining frogs, or whatever the 100-year events are that we don't expect to happen. There's a lot of them, right? So what are the odds of any one occurring in any given year? It's actually pretty good. We don't think of it that way. We think these are rare events and they shouldn't occur. But if there's enough rare events, just like the lottery, rare events that occur, that can occur, one of them's most likely to occur. Very interesting. And he also points out in the media, when we think about this uncertainty in these events occurring, he points out the decline of local news has all kinds of different implications. One is that we don't get much attention is that the wider news becomes the more likely it is to be pessimistic. Two things that make it so. Bad news gets more attention than good news because pessimism is seductive and feels more urgent than optimism. Again, something that never changes. That's kind of, it's been true through all time and probably will be true in the future. But if we're aware of it, we can change our mindset a little bit. The odds of bad news story, a fraud, a corruption, a disaster occurring in your local town at any given moment is low. However, when we expand your attention nationally, the odds increase. When we expand it globally, the odds of something terrible happening in any given moment are 100%. So, again, he's saying, due to the fact that we don't pay attention to local news much anymore, we either nationally or globally, just because of the way we get our information sources, the chances of something bad happening and occurring is going to be much greater when you expand the universe like that. So not only is it happening, you're more likely to hear about it, which is something I tell people all the time. But again, it's the awareness of this that's important. And then you can say, okay, it's not unusual that I'm hearing about a mass killing in Bangladesh where previously we might have never heard about it. Number 4 thing, and I think this is so true, and I wish I was a better storyteller, and I think I've mentioned it on this podcast before. Hopefully I don't get confusing in retelling my stories from these books, but he points out the best story wins. Not the best idea, or the right idea, or the most rational idea. Just whoever tells a story that catches people's attention and gets them to nod their heads is the one who tends to be rewarded. Now, I always thought this was terribly unfair, especially since I'm not a great storyteller. And I'm doing these podcasts. I'm hoping I'm honing that skill a little bit because I'm not necessarily a talker and a storyteller. Hopefully, I'm gathering that skill because I do realize to get your message across, you have to be a good storyteller. It's not just having the bright idea or the most rational idea. It's having the story behind it that gets people's attention, that catches them and pulls them in. So it might be a mediocre story, or it might be a mediocre idea, but if you can really, quote unquote, sell it, people will buy it. And I think that happens in politics, that happens in business, that happens all throughout. And he points this out as being one of those things that never changes. So it's something to be aware of. So if you come across a good storyteller, I guess that's how con men have made it far in life. They're very good at telling a story. Con men comes from confidence men. And they get people's confidence, right? By telling a story, by being smooth, by being well-spoken. They could draw people in and get them to believe what they're saying, even though it might be total, BS. Very interesting. Good to note. Number 4. I'm only going to go through 5 of these things, and as I've said throughout all these podcasts, these books are much more in-depth. I'm just giving you examples of some of the things that he says. I do think this is a very interesting book because I do think trying to predict things is very difficult, and the way we think about predictions is kind of usually backwards. And I've never read a book like this that kind of highlights some of the things that we as humans do when we think about things and how we behave, that if you can at least hang your hat on these, that you might help you make decisions in your life or try to figure out what's going to happen down the line. So I think this is very helpful. So I guess the last one I will point out here, which I think is another interesting example, is he points out in the chapter called Calm Plants the Seeds of Crazy, which is an interesting phenomenon and one that I haven't thought of. So he gives a little story here. Imagine a world where the stock market never went down. Sort of kind of what the world we've been living in the last 3 or 4 years or so, and why people are thinking that we're now living in maybe a market bubble. I mean, even housing prices have gone up significantly. All asset prices, gold, Bitcoin, everything has kind of gone up. So people are kind of hinting that we might be moving towards a bubble. Anyways, so he goes on. Imagine a world where the stock market never went down. Market stability is all but assured, and stocks only go up. What would you do? You would buy as many stocks as you possibly could. You would mortgage your house and buy more. You'd consider selling a kidney and buy more still. That would be the reasonable thing to do, right? And in the process, if you knew that stocks were only going to go up, that's what you would do. It would be the rational thing. And in the process, the price of stocks would get bid up. So this is kind of the market rationality, right? A behavior look at the market, the stock market, that if everyone thinks it, it will happen, right? If people think the market will go up, they will invest in the market, which then bids the price up, which then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And that's kind of how bubbles are created. Their valuations would become ever more expensive. They would get so expensive that their future return prospects would decline to zero. Therefore, you're sort of in the bubble territory, right? The prices don't make sense in regards to the companies you're buying into. AI is a big thing now. It's hard to predict what's going to happen with AI in the future. We're kind of doing a momentum buy into the market now. We're kind of all, the market seems to be going in for AI with sort of the uncertainty of the future. It might be great. It might not be so great. It might be mediocre. Who knows what the future holds? But to acknowledge that this is what's happening in the market is important if you're going to invest in it and you're going to base your future on it. And at that very moment, the seeds of the breakdown would start to sprout. The mere idea of stability causes a smart and rational movement toward bidding asset prices up high enough to cause instability, which is an interesting concept. So it's the stable prices, that the fact that they're going up and up and up, therefore causes the future instability when you're saying, oh my gosh, they're too high up. We've got what they call a frothy market, over-exuberance. We better start going back. And the same thing happens on the way down, by the way. People start selling. They see the price go down. They sell. It's a downward spiral. Something that you might be familiar with, but he kind of points it out that stability is destabilizing. Or put another way, calm plants the seeds of crazy, always has and always will. And he goes in here, he brings up COVID in regards to this, which is kind of interesting, but from a different perspective from what I just brought it up. He notes, historian Dan Carlin wrote his book, The End is Always Near. Pretty much nothing separates us from human beings in earlier eras than how much less disease affects us. If we moderns lived for 1 year with the sort of death rates our pre-industrial age ancestors perpetually lived with, we'd be in societal shock. Modern life in general is about as safe as it's ever been. And effectively, all the improvement over the last century has come from a decline in infectious disease. In 1900, roughly 800 per 100,000 Americans died each year from infectious disease. So 800 out of 100,000 people each year died of infectious disease, almost 1% of the population. 1% would be 1,000, right? By 2014, that was 46. So it went from 800 per 100,000 to 46 per 100,000, a 94% decline. That's just from 1900 to 2014. This decline is probably the best thing ever to happen to humanity. To follow that sentence with but is a step too far. It's an entirely good thing. However, it does create an anomaly. It goes on to point out the decline in deaths from infectious disease has made the world less equipped to handle them. Maybe not medically, but certainly psychologically. What was a tragic but unexpected part of life 100 years ago is now a tragic and inconceivable part of modern life, which is indeed what made the COVID-19 pandemic so shocking and overwhelming. So it's all this progress. Again, he points out, calm plants the seeds of crazy. So it's all this progress that we've made on infectious disease, eradicating it, that has got us to the point where now we're looking, well, as far as COVID-19 goes, where we're shocked that we can have a worldwide infectious disease where it would have been much more common 100, 150 years ago. It would have been more normal, and at least psychologically we would have handled it a little bit better. Also, I would point out, in regards to our current debate about vaccines, the fact that they prevent us from getting infectious diseases, I think is being taken a little bit for granted. Hopefully we don't go down that path too far. I do think it's always good to question science. I mean, that's what science is. It's questioning hypothesis and what's gone before, and we should always do that factually and rigorously. However, just because we don't have all the answers to something doesn't mean that taking vaccines is a bad thing. And hopefully we don't get down the road too far where we've reintroduced some of these infectious diseases into our country where we've kind of stubbed our own toe. Again, I think it's good to question these things, to pursue them, especially if there's people who have incentives to push these things on us, and if testing hasn't been done thoroughly, all good things to make sure. But if it's this point in regards to what he's making, that it's the calmness that seeds the future crazy, I think thinking about things in that way might help us have a different perspective on what's occurring currently. So hopefully some of these things that I just mentioned, the 5 things, have relevance to where we're at today, right? And I think they do, because they're something that, as he points out, don't really change. They've existed for all of our humankind, or at least he hypothesizes they have, and we can kind of count on them as happening in the future. So when we look at what might happen in the future, we can kind of look at these things and say, okay, we know how humans behave, and this is kind of how I can incorporate that into my thoughts about what might happen in the future. So hopefully this is helpful. A little bit shorter, but I didn't want to go into too many examples, but he gives many more throughout the book. I think it's a really helpful book to kind of think sort of outside of the box, maybe on some things that we kind of are, keep in the back of our mind, but if we put in the front of our mind and become more aware of it, it will help us in our daily lives. And that's all I seek to do with bringing up these podcasts, is kind of, if I can help anyone in a little way lead a better and more enjoyable life, that will be thanks enough. So thanks again for listening. I always appreciate the time and effort you put into listening to what I have to say. I hope you enjoyed this. Please provide me any feedback. Hopefully you know where to find me, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care. Again, before I end, let me remember the name of this book for you. Same as Ever, A Guide to What Never Changes by Morgan Housel. A very good read and highly recommended. Take care.